Hello and welcome to the first video lecture for the CDS AP World History class. Today I'm going to review part 4 of the textbook, the Early Modern Period. As I go through this lecture, I'm going to use the AP key concepts to anchor my points, and hopefully that will give you an idea of some of the major themes that we will continually discuss during this term. So part 4, which we call the Early Modern Period, and that's what we studied mostly during term 2. So there are 3 key concepts for this part. The first one is 4.1, globalizing networks of communication and exchange. And that's when we talked about how things went from being located in smaller areas, maybe between regions, to the whole world. And that's with the introduction of the Americas. 4.2 is new forms of social organization and modes of production. And that's talking about how in the early modern period we had some changes in the way that society was organized. We had some changes in the way that things were produced. Not necessarily big changes, but some new ways to do those things. And finally, 4.3 is state consolidation and imperial expansion. And what that means is that some existing states, empires, and kingdoms became stronger, gained more power, possibly through absolute monarchy or parliamentary monarchy. And the same states in some cases and other states managed to expand, take over large amounts of land, and in some cases actually land across oceans. So let's get into it. So the globalizing networks and communication and exchange are made possible by technical innovations, especially the highly developed compass, the lateen sail, and the stern post rudder, which allowed for more development along trade routes. One of the biggest changes there is the inclusion of the Americas, as we mentioned before. And one of the ways to think about this is that trade moves from oceanic, as in the Indian Ocean Trade Network, where you stay in the same ocean and you stay on the edges of it, to transoceanic, as in the Atlantic system, where you can go across an entire ocean. And going across that Atlantic Ocean requires those new technical innovations. In order to deal with these new trade routes and kind of broader trade routes, Europeans and others used new systems of economic organization, like joint stock companies, to share money that is needed at the beginning, to share risk, but also it means that they share the money that they make at the end. One of the major results of these changes was the Columbian Exchange, which I think you know quite well about. But that's the exchange of diseases, of people, of food, of other kind of environmental effects between the Eastern and Western hemispheres, between Eurasia and Africa and the Americas. And that really is brought about because of this new globalizing network that's based on the technical innovations. Finally, it's not just goods and diseases that spread along the trade routes, but some cultural aspects spread as well. Specifically, new religions formed in the Americas as different religions from Africa and Europe and the Americas combined. Think religions like Santeria, a syncretic religion that mixes Catholicism with African and indigenous American religions. And in other parts of Eurasia, existing religions like Islam and Buddhism spread further along the new trade routes. And it's not just that trade expanded, there were some instances where traditional methods of production also expanded. So for instance, people grew things in much the same way that they used to grow them, but they might have grown them in more places, or they might have expended more labor to grow more of it. An example of that would be the plantation farming in the Americas. So they haven't really changed the method of how you grow sugar, but they're applying much more labor to it, mostly through coerced labor by bringing slaves from Africa and forcing them to work on sugar plantations. They haven't changed the method, but they've managed to up production by some amount by having more people working on it. Key concept 4.3, state consolidation and imperial expansion, focuses on 2 things. One is that some states, some governments, manage to come together and become stronger. Some examples would be Russia tries to consolidate, the Mughal Empire tries to consolidate during this time, and Some of them are successful and some are less successful. But also empires tried to expand at this time. In this case, the Mughal Empire provides another example, and they're particularly telling along with the Ottoman Empire because they relied on new gunpowder weapons and especially gunpowder artillery to expand into their territories. Another example of an expanding empire would be Spain or Portugal, who also used gunpowder weapons, but mounted them on ships to harness the power of their new navies. Now, I don't want to overstate the newness of this. These are isolated examples. Most of the world was still working the way it had been working before. And what we would say is that it was still part of the traditional world. Now, what I mean by traditional is that it still uses essentially the same techniques and methods that had been used for possibly thousands of years before. Some examples are that power, the way you move things, came from traditional sources like animals and people. In the case of ships, wind, and possibly the limited use of water to turning water wheels. And that power was used to produce food for agricultural purposes. And that hadn't changed for a long time. So basically, the amount of production per person, the amount of food and goods produced by per each person in 1700 was not that different than it had been in 1000. And that's kind of surprising given all the new stuff I've just told you about. That even though all those things happened, even by the end of the early modern period, around 700 CE, you still see people with about the same amount of food, the same amount of goods as they had before. But with industrialization, we're going to leave behind that traditional world of stagnant growth where people always seem to make the same amount per person and move into this new world which is based on this idea of industrialization. And that's why we'll call Part 5 the Industrial Age.